Hi there. In order to do homework question 1.22 on your graphing calculator, you need to be able to plot two line plots simultaneously. So in this video, I want to show you how to do that. So step one, let me move this so you can see my calculator. Step one, let's clear the data you may have in your lists. So if you press the Stat button and press Enter, right now I'm working with, as you can see on the screen, lists 4 and list 5. You're probably working with lists 1 or 2 or 3. I already have my data in those lists, so I scrolled over to lists 4 and 5 so I could show you this. If you want to eliminate data in a list, you should press the up arrow to highlight the name of the list. Then be very careful, hit the clear button, and then press the down arrow. That will clear the data from the list. So don't do the following. If I press the right arrow, I can go over to list 5 and I can press the up arrow. So with list 5 highlighted, what I don't want to do is press the delete key. If you do this, notice that list 5 actually is gone from the screen. So if you do that, you have to go back and set up the editor again so that you can see list 5. So to do that, you would have to press the Stat button. You would have to select option number 5. That is the setup editor. This option literally means reset the editor so that you can see all of the lists in your editor. So if you press Enter twice, that will execute that command on the home screen. So now if you go back into the editor by pressing Stat and Enter, there's the data that I'm going to have you enter in just a moment, but you'll notice if I scroll over, list 5 is back. So again, the proper way to clear it would be to go up and highlight L5, press the clear key, and then press the down arrow. Very good. So let me go back to the home screen for just a second, and I'm going to switch over here. These are the data that I want you to enter into list 1, list 2, and list 3. So into list 1, please enter these years from 2010 all the way back to 1930. All of those go into list 1. Then into list 2, I'm going to ask you to list these values. These are average life expectancies for males in 2010 all the way back to 1930. This is in the United States. Then same thing over here for females. Their average life expectancy in 2010 is 81.1 years, all the way back to 1930, 61.6. So at this point, you might want to pause the video so that you can see these two lists. Again, enter year into list 1, enter male into list 2, enter female into list 3, and then you can play the video again and you'll be ready to see how we set up two line graphs simultaneously so that we can compare changes in male and female life expectancy in the United States over time. All right, let me go back to my calculator. So as you can see, I have the data already in lists 1, 2, and 3. Here it is. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we have two plots that are set up correctly and turned on. So I'm going to press the second button and the Y equals button. Here are my stat plots. Right now, plot number 1 is already on, but it is not set properly. Right now, it's set to a histogram option, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to press Enter. It is turned on. You need to make sure that plot 1 is turned on. But this is the option that we want now. This is a line graph. So to get to that option, I'll need to press the down arrow. I'll have to press the right arrow and select that option by pressing Enter. So in order to graph a line graph, this will be for the male life expectancies. Essentially, we're going to plot ordered pairs. The X values will be what's in list 1. Those X values are the years, and the Y values are the actual male life expectancies. Those are in list 2. Now, I don't want to just plot the male life expectancies. I also want to be able to see the female ones at the same time so that I can compare them. So pressing second Y equals, we're going to go into plot 2. Right now it's turned off. So I'm going to press the down arrow and press Enter. First thing I'm going to do is turn on plot 2 by pressing Enter. Now on is highlighted. I'm going to change the type once again to a line graph. Press enter. So now I want to make sure that I'm plotting the female data against years. So the years are still in list 1, that's fine, but the Y list, the female life expectancies are in list 3, not in list 2. So I need to press the down arrow a couple of times to get to the Y list value, and I need to change that from L2 to L3. So to get L3, I'll press 2nd and 3. Press enter. There we go. So both of the plots are turned on. The next thing we need to do is set a good window. So I'll press the window button. If you go back and think about the data, the lowest year that we want to graph is 1930. So I'm going to go a little lower than that. Give us a little space on the screen. I'll put 1920 in for the minimum. The maximum year was 2010. So again, to have a little extra space on the screen, I'm going to put 2020. This X scale does not matter. Unlike in a histogram, the X scale here doesn't do anything to the graph. I'm simply going to type in a 10. That's relatively standard. So pressing my down arrow, the Y values represent life expectancies. For both men and women, the lowest life expectancy was 58.1. So I'm going to put in, for instance, 55. For my Y minimum. No life expectancy exceeded 85. The highest was 81.1. So I'm going to make my Y maximum 85. Again, the Y scale doesn't matter. I'm going to change that Y scale to a 5. It doesn't really affect the graph. So at this point, the data are in lists 1, 2, and 3. I have both plots 1 and 2 turned on and set to line graphs with the appropriate data. I've got a good window, so if we press graph, we should be able to see our 2 line graphs. So here they are. If you press the trace button, notice the first thing you'll see, this cursor is flashing on the bottom line. So notice at the top of the screen it says P1, that stands for plot 1. Plot 1 includes L1 and L2, and I know that in L2 that is where the male data is. So this lower line represents the male life expectancies, and if I press the arrow buttons, if I press the right and left arrow buttons, I can trace along the line graph. Now, something to think about, it is tracing along the graph, not in numeric order. It is tracing along the graph in the order that the data are entered into the list. So recognize we entered the data into reverse order. That's why it seems a little strange, but that's why as we press the right and left arrows, pressing the left arrow actually takes us up. And that would be because the data are listed in reverse order. So that's not as important. What's important here, I want you to recognize if you press the up arrow, you can get to the second line of the graph. This is plot 2. We are plotting lists 1 and list 3. List 3 is where the female data is. So again, by pressing the right arrow, interestingly enough, again, it should take us backwards. The left arrow will take us forwards, and that's because we listed the data in reverse order in our list editor. So not a big deal. So if I press the graph button again, what's important here is to make a comparison about the 2 trends that we see on this plot. These are both time plots. So I am looking at how male life expectancies change over time. And then similarly, above, I'm looking at how female life expectancies change over time. So the point of something like this, when you're looking at these 2 graphs simultaneously, in order to compare them, I don't really need to describe them in terms of their shapes or their centers or their spreads. When we're looking at line graphs, we're looking at trends over time. That's really what we want to describe. Eventually, we will be comparing graphs. We will be comparing histograms or stem and leaf plots, for instance, where we will be comparing shapes and centers and spreads. But that's not the point on a time graph or on line graphs like this. I'm just comparing the trends over time. I just want you to get used to the idea of comparing. I want you to get used to the idea of being able to graph multiple graphs simultaneously on the calculator. This can be very handy. So please don't overestimate the importance of the obvious. Don't ignore the obvious. On the screen, the first observation you would want to make is that, on average, females tend to live longer. And that's because at all points along this graph, the female trend line is always above the male trend line. So that's one thing that's obvious when you look at the graph. The second thing to look at, again, don't ignore the obvious, both trend lines are rising over time. So both male and female life expectancies in the United States are rising from the period 1930 to 2010. So, some observations that are a little more detailed. At the very beginning, the difference between male and female life expectancy was pretty consistent in 1930, 1940, 1950. Then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that gap seems to widen here, and then it seems to be decreasing again. The difference between male and female life expectancy seems to be decreasing. It looks like at some level the males are catching up. So that's one observation that you could make. Another observation that you could make is that change in life expectancy, so the rate at which life expectancy is increasing, is different for men and women over time. Maybe from 1940 to 1950, both for men and women, it looks like the slopes of those little segments on this line graph, the slopes are pretty similar. It looks like their rates of change are the same. But then notice here, from 1950 to 1960 or 1960 to 1970, women have a particular slope, but the men's graph tends to be flatter at that location, which means that their increase in life expectancy for some reason wasn't as great as it was for the females from 1950 to 1960 to 1970. So understand, by making comparisons, we are comparing trends over time. I'm not trying to compare centers. I'm not trying to compare spreads. I suppose at some level I'm comparing shapes because I'm looking at the patterns that I see through time, the two trends. However, we really don't describe this in terms of shape, center, and spread. We're just trying to describe the overall trends that we see and the changes to those trends over time. So the question 1.22 that I asked you to try in your homework assignment, instead of life expectancies, you are going to be graphing data from General Motors and from Toyota. Quality data, you'll be looking at that data over time, so it's probably easiest to get those data graphed in your graphing calculator to get two line plots as we did in this example. And then once you have them graphed, write 2, 3, 4 sentences comparing the data. Compare what you see for quality data for General Motors and Toyota over time. Good luck.